The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
All right. So, the Great Ferris Wheel was created for the World's Fair. One of the most popular attractions. That's B. Populace or the rural farmers sought to curb corporate power. D. 2. 3. The gentleman's agreement denied passports for Japanese workers intending to immigrate to the U.S. B. Is it boy? 4. America's first step towards territorial expansion was purchase of Alaska and the Midway Island. C. 5. Characteristics of a new woman. It's all the above. C. 6. In which new way was the federal government able to fund the growing size? It was this income tax. So A. 7. Upton Sinclair wrote the book The Jungle. A. And 8. Newport, Rhode Island. B was the most prestigious place to spend the summer in the Gilded Age. A. 9. Carrie Nation wielded an axe in bars, and that's A. 10. What was unusual about the terms of office served by Grover Cleveland? They were non-consecutive. C. Unemployment reached 20% during the Panic of 1893. C. 12. Spring of 1894, Coxey's Army marched on Washington. B. 13. The main goal of muckrakers was to raise public awareness of social problems and corruption in business and government. B. 14. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution provided for the direct election of U.S. Senators. B. The Keating-Owen Act declared that, which was unfortunately declared unconstitutional, forbid the sale of goods over state lines when produced by children. C. 16. 1912, Theodore Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party. D. 17. And what was the goal of the progressive movement? It's A. They sought to regulation and protection of the people from the excesses of big business. 18. What did President Roosevelt do in 1902 during the coal mining strike? So it's he threatened to nationalize the mines if the owners wouldn't negotiate. That's B. 19. Theodore Roosevelt's policy of conservation was a policy designed to do what? It was protect federal lands responsibly and use the resources where needed. C. 20. What made the name of Woodrow Wilson's campaign policy? What was the name of Woodrow Wilson's campaign policy in 1912? It's New Freedom. D. 21. The United States declared war on Spain after the battleship Maine blew up in Havana's harbor. A.
Wait, what was 21? A?
A. Yes. A. 22. On May 1st, 1898, Commodore George Dewey led the Americans to victory against the Spanish in Manila Bay, Philippines. 23. The Yellow Press was the sensationalistic American journalism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. B. 1914, Henry Ford began to pay his workers $5 a day. B. 25. An appalling aspect of the Filipino War was that over 220,000 Filipinos died. C. 26. Under President McKinley, American foreign policy regarding China emphasized economic empire based on free trade, known as the open door policy. C. 27. What was the Roosevelt Quarterly? It was
C.
C. C. If a nation in the Western Hemisphere appeared politically or fiscally unstable, we loaned them money and send in our bankers. So C. 28. Dollar diplomacy. Oh wait, sorry. That's enough. Yeah, so C is, the Roosevelt Quarterly is about us protecting our neighbors and keeping Europeans out, so that's what C is for 27. And dollar diplomacy is when we send in bankers instead of the military, so that's B. 29. A Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and ignited an alliance system that led to World War I. A. 30. The Teller Amendment guaranteed Cuba's independence, and the Platt Amendment sought to have strict American controls on the island nation. A. 31. What was the punitive expedition? It was when the army was sent to capture Pancho Villa in Mexico. B. 32. What was ironic about Wilson's campaign slogan? He kept us out of war. It was ironic because he exploited it for political popularity, but didn't really like it because he knew he would have to join the war probably pretty soon. So it had ended. So that's D. 33. In order to bring about the downfall of the Herta government in Mexico, Wilson sent the Navy to Veracruz. B. 34. The Arctic Pledge is when the German government's pledge to the United States not to sink passenger ships without warning. A. 35. Settlement houses were reform institutions to help families bring up children, often immigrants, and some of the most well-known one in Chicago. B. 36. Who were the two heroes of Spanish-American War? Roosevelt and Dewey. C. 37. How did the government attempt to limit criticism of World War I, Espionage Act and the Sedition Act? A. What was the Zimmerman telegram, the secret German diplomatic communication that offered Mexico to recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if Mexico would start a war with the United States? A. What was the 460-mile-long theater of war, the Western Front? C. 40. The Roosevelt administration encouraged the overthrow of the Colombian government on the Isthmus of Panama. A. Who was the American millionaire responsible for saving the United States economy in the panic of 1893 and 1907? J.P. Morgan. D. What did the Clayton Antitrust Act do? It strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. Of course, that was D. And then 43. Who was the presidential candidate that made the cross-goal speech? William Jennings Bryan. So the short answer is why is Roosevelt often considered the first modern president? It's because he really sought to increase the power of the presidency. That's the main thing. But if you wrote other things, depending on what you wrote about his progressive ideas or being a trust buster or something like that, you would have gotten partial points.
Sought to see the what? The answer.
Oh, increase the powers of the president, but of course he did a lot of things. So generally, if you wrote something, you might have got anywhere from between half and a full point, depending on how you said it. Lewis Hine photographed children in the workplace that helped to bring about awareness of their plight. Influenza pandemic was called the Spanish flu. 46. Allied powers and Central powers. Also, other than the U.S. The U.S. is a little too simple, but Great Britain, of course, France are two major ones, but many of the Western European nations, of course, not Spain. Few people wrote Spain; they were neutral. And then Central powers: Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire were the most common. Those 47. Remember that there were actually 60 nations in total that were that fought in the war. Yeah. Oh, that reminds me. I'm not thrilled when I go through your video quiz, and I can definitely tell when you're not watching the quiz and you're just Googling the answers, and I can tell you. 47. Who gave the Atlanta Compromise speech? It was Booker T. Washington. 48. How did World War II, World War I change career opportunities for women? So, so just to tell me that they got more jobs, he's not happy with that kind of answer. You had to tell me something about what kind of jobs, like factory jobs, of course, the high-paying men's work that they had been allowed to do before. Certainly, you could, if you said something, depending on what you said about them being in the military, that was another. Some people said they thought they did not fight in the war. That's not something women were allowed to do.
No, they were just the clerical.
Clerical, yeah. But they were given rank in some instances, but that's different. Getting rank and being allowed into the front lines and fight on the battlefield are two different things. 3 progressive demands. So there's something like 16 of them. So shorter work days, safer workplaces, ending child labor, women getting the right to vote, banning alcohol. So those are the most common ones. What was that?
Taxes.
Oh, right, income tax. So direct election of U.S. senators. So those are all the most common ones that people wrote. Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt. There were 2 New York socialites who were very competitive with each other. Alva Vanderbilt, of course, was big into the suffrage movement, not Caroline Astor. Some people wrote they were both. What problem did First Lady Ellen Wilson attempt to solve? The problem of the living conditions in the alley slums of the African American community. Approximately how many people died on Lusitania? Actually 1,198 did die. Some people on your video quiz were writing 1,201. They actually did give you that. I said approximately, but I think you Googled that somewhere. 128 Americans died. Some people wrote things like 7,000, 80,000. Okay, 80,000 people on one ship. Think about it.
Sink the ship.
That would be a big book.
I don't know.
Well, you know, they make cruise lines.
I've been on some big ships and they've never had 80,000 people.
Thousands.
That's a small
Whatever.
city.
Last semester, I think someone wrote 1,000,000.
That's a big city.
No, but you, on the quiz though, on one of the quiz, you put that the Americans was 123 and I was.
Oh, wait, someone said that.
It was me.
I looked.
I wrote it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but I looked. Okay, well maybe my eyes are going, so maybe it looked like an 8 to me. But
It did?
I
Okay,
will
look,
go back
because
and
I
look
draw
at
my
it.
8s with circles, so
Okay.
a 3 is
Well,
like half of
it's
an 8
typed.
for me.
It's typed, so
So
I even
I
did
can
look
agree,
in
but
one
just
of the.
to let you know.
I looked in one of them. Maybe I didn't look in the right one. Because when I got your email, I went and looked, and maybe I looked in the. Did you send a video quiz or the
No, just the regular.
regular? Maybe I looked in the video quiz and not in the.
Yeah, it was the regular quiz
Okay.
when we did our.
Well, I'll go
work.
back and change the 3 and 8 for next.
No, I was like, well, I don't know which one he wants me to put, so I'm just thinking.
Yeah. Sorry about that. If it marked you wrong.
No, you didn't. It didn't.
Okay.
No.
And then the last one is what could Americans do when first arriving at the White House on New Year's Day? You could shake the hand of the president. Came right from the video. I don't assume there are any copies since no one's been done. Oh, geez.
I'm sorry.
No,
There's one.
That's okay.
For number 20.
Yeah. It should have given you. I should have given you the credit. So does it say okay next to yours?
Yeah, mine does.
Yours does.
Mine just wrote one wrong.
Let me see if I changed it.
I had to recount mine too, because I had.
It was a 5. I ran through the second time. Oh, stuff like that, is it?
I think I did my first.
Rate me up for what? I got grade 5.
A 20 was, I guess, the problem with it. He just put okay next to it. It should have been
Yeah.
8, I believe. I think it said 8. No, 20. It was the, no, wait a minute, it was the 20 was D. New Freedom.
New Freedom should be D. I wrote okay.
Yeah, all right. I had that.
All right. Yeah, I know it's an error. I should put. Oh, I forgot to tell you that because you took it separately. Okay, I'll make sure you get the credit. Okay. Don't leave today before I do that.
Yes, we are.
You get to keep these?
I was like, yay, I finally did it. No, I think they tell me about it, though, they said that.
So we're gonna move on to the Roaring 20s. Which for many people, they weren't that roaring.
No.
Most people, they weren't roaring.
Hopefully it doesn't disappoint me.
Yeah, I wasn't here today, but they were telling me about that. No, they said that it happens all the time. But why would we do it? Like, for, you know, like information, you know, like that. Man, I was really Here's a chair. Wrap it up.
Okay. So what kind, I don't know, like is there anything that kind of still in the popular imagination about the 1920s? Like,
I love the
Yeah.
flapper girls.
okay, the flappers, right. That's a great image, the flappers of the 1920s. They're much more daring than their mothers, who were the new women, who were already somewhat daring. But so that's a good image of the 1920s. The 20s are, often seen as a time of, carefree time, young people going out, having a good time, or people in general. Young people especially, because of the horrors of the First World War. People lost friends and relatives, and they realized how short life was. So there is this kind of carefree attitude that does permeate American society in the 1920s. But there were a lot of worries in the 1920s as well. So we'll talk about that. So the new woman was, essentially this is what the new woman had looked like. The Gibson girl was, so there were illustrations in the early 20th century portraying kind of this idealized woman, the young woman of the early decades of the 1900s, before the 1920s. So, you have a woman who still wore long gowns. They had long hair, which they generally wore up, and they wore corsets to give them this idealized shape of what a woman was supposed to look like, an hourglass shape. They're supposed to have very, very tiny little waists, but of course corsets were really very constricting and horrible to wear, caused lots of birth defects. Young babies in their cribs were already having their bodies deformed by their mothers putting them in little corsets.
What?
Uh-huh. It would start to make the little girls from very early ages starting to wear corsets to get used to it.
Baby wearing a corset.
I can't wait to get my little infant a corset.
This is something that's all rejected by the most young women in the 1920s. So, as you said, the flappers. So, just a few years before, it had been scandalous if a woman were even to show her ankles in public, and now there's this huge transformation in the way that women dress and portray themselves. So they cut their hair short. They wear short dresses. They go. Now, of course, the new woman had already done a number of things that had previously not been okay. Even in the late 19th century, you saw women going to department stores on their own. But now in the 1920s, young women, it becomes essentially okay in most families for young women to go out on their own no matter where they're going, even if they're going to a nightclub. Oh yeah, they started to smoke too. So they smoke, they would drink.
They drunk. Jazz.
Cutting their hair is a big, because the 1920s is when jazz comes out. It's the jazz age. It's another term you can use for the 1920s.
Is that the Great Gatsby?
That's Great Gatsby is portrayed during that period.
Yeah, that's how
That's Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I like day parts.
Yeah. So as I said, can be known as the Roaring '20s or the Jazz Age.
Yeah.
And we'll talk more about one of the interesting things about society at the time is that Americans are on wheels. Large numbers of Americans can afford to buy automobiles by this time, with Henry Ford raising his wages and other companies raising their wages. But there's always a caveat to that. So I'll get to that in a little while. But this was really interesting that most Americans are moving into the middle class or have moved into the middle class, and so that's really significant. So the traffic jams in American cities changed from having traffic jams with people having their carts pulled by horses to now automobiles, and of course still large numbers of streetcars, because everybody can't afford a car yet, and public transportation is very important and actually makes sense in high density areas, and we're finally realizing that again nowadays after decades of everyone thinking that they should just be able to drive everywhere, and it's slowly happening. Do you know where this picture was taken?
Chicago?
It's actually here. It's on Woodward Avenue.
Oh.
Looking towards the river. So, and this is the first street lights were in Detroit. And there was a guy who would be in there, and he would have to change the lights manually.
When did they take out the trolleys for Detroit?
Sometime in 1950s.
Just
All
when
the
they-
streetcars. The auto companies were buying up all the streetcar companies in the country, put them out of business so they could sell. Everyone had to take cars, buy a car.
And now they bring it back.
Yeah. So, thanks to people like you guys, young people don't want to have as many cars as they used to. Or always have to have a car.
No, because we can't afford cars.
Oh.
That's why.
Well,
We can afford
if it
to
makes
take
you
the
feel
roads
any
off.
better, I only bought my first brand new car in 2014.
Really?
Yeah, because I couldn't afford a car.
See? That's what I'm saying.
Still can't afford it.
Still can't. Yeah, I couldn't either.
Not only were most of the automobiles in the world here in the United States, we produce most of the oil in the world. Actually, we're a large producer of oil even today. Do you know why?
You ship it overseas.
Well, do you know where it's coming from? What kind of oil?
Oh, no.
Like in the tar sands. So all that takes a lot of energy to actually create gasoline out of that sticky oil up in the Dakotas or Montana. No, it's up in north, like along the Canadian border. The condition of the roads will begin to change in the 1920s due to the Federal Highway Act. The Good Roads movement had been around for about 30 years by this time, maybe a little over 30 years. Because, of course, the bicycle clubs had been agitating for better roads. But it's not until America is on wheels, buying automobiles in large numbers, that the Good Roads movement really starts to take off. And people were fed up with the condition of the roads as they begin to have their own automobile. And people still took, of course, trains commonly, but nevertheless, more and more they were driving further and further distances with their automobiles. The Model T, not only is it is it affordable to large numbers of working people? It's pretty heavy duty car, and so it can navigate the bad road conditions that you would find in those days. When I was doing my research about the college from a number of years ago, for a big project I had to do when I first got hired, I came across a photograph of when this campus opened, and Bunnert, just over here, it was that's what it looked like.
It looked
that
like
first semester, or at least that first year. I don't know exactly when they paved it, but when they first opened the campus, there's pictures of students driving these enormous cars from the 1960s all out in the mud.
Well, the houses over there look like farmhouses.
Yeah, there was one really old farmhouse,
Yeah.
an Italianate from the 19th century. So the last few months, of course, the plight of the workers is always coming up, and unskilled workers are still having a tough go of it. Actually, in the 1920s, you'll even see wages being lowered as corporations want to increase their profitability. But for skilled workers, which of course have increasingly been smaller and smaller percentages of the work population, the companies are treating them better than ever. For skilled workers, they're providing medical services, vacation time, insurance, mortgage loans, sports teams, and social clubs were available for skilled workers. It was a way to entice them to not join unions, and therefore they would be more complacent workers, happy workers. Unfortunately, what the companies didn't see is if you treated all your workers that way, they also would find a need to have to join a union.
Right.
But anyway, that's known as welfare capitalism. Before the Great Depression, if you were going, it was not as common to be able to own your own house. Detroit's a little bit different because of the auto industry really created a working class people who made good wages and could afford to buy their own houses. Detroit is a very unusual city because it's so huge with single family houses, unlike most cities in the way they developed where most people lived in apartments. That's important. Getting a mortgage is very different before the Great Depression in this country. It is not a long-term loan. It's a relatively short-term loan. And it's a loan in which you have to put up a huge down payment. It's very common to have 50% of the cost of the house has to be put down as a down payment, and then you get a mortgage for something like 3 to 5 years. So it's not like what will become standard later on, where you can get mortgages for 20 years, 30 years. That would be the norm. And then, of course, that certainly helped expand the home buyers because, if you can make these payments over long periods of time, more people can afford it. I was in Canada a few years ago, and I stayed in a bed and breakfast, and the owner of the bed and breakfast was saying that essentially it's still basically like that in Canada. It's much more difficult to buy a house. The mortgages are much shorter time period. So I was pretty shocked because I thought, that was kind of an antiquated way of doing business. Big corporations, of course, dominated business, dominated the economy before the 1920s, as you know. The progressive movement certainly made inroads to limiting the power of big corporations. But in the 1920s, many of those progressive victories that had occurred are getting rolled back. no longer do you find presidents of the United States who are progressive. They are much more conservative than Roosevelt or Taft or Wilson, and so you start to see things going back to the way that they had been. And therefore, those unskilled workers really were left with anyone looking out for their needs and interests. It's still illegal. I mean, it's not illegal, but it's still perfectly acceptable under the legal system. If you join a union, you can be fired without cause, which that would be the cause, but it doesn't matter. You can join a union, and if they don't like that you joined a union, or they find that you're what they would believe to be a troublemaker, getting other people to join the union, you could certainly be fired for that if you're working for a company. And certainly, even if you're an African American, there's a great deal of discrimination in the big companies if you're black. And so, of course, we learned that African Americans were joining the workforce in larger and larger numbers up in the north. But what you find is that often they are given the worst jobs. At the auto companies, it's very common to hire African Americans in the foundries, where they're smelting the iron ore. That's the worst job you could have. Extremely dangerous, hard work. Just want you to know that it's the better life, but not that much better. It's certainly better than sharecropping. Yellow dog contracts can be common at this time. Signing an agreement that you won't join the union, essentially saying, my boss can fire me if I join a union. And that, of course, puts workers in a difficult situation because, of course, you need a job, right? Everyone's probably at this point had a job or have a job now, right? You want a job. But how would you feel if they told you when you signed your work papers that, well, you can't join a union, you can't do anything to try to make your life better, and so we're gonna do whatever we can to make our profits really high and ensure that you just work a whole lot too much. No one's gonna like that.
Oh, they're still doing it.
Right. Yeah, actually, I can
Still
tell
like
you,
that.
I worked at a department store in California when I first graduated from college, and they used to make us punch out, and then if we hadn't finished closing up or cleaning up, whatever we had to do, they'd make us go back to work and finish up.
I punch back in.
I know.
They still do it.
And but I was like 22 or something like that, 23, and I really needed to pay my very expensive rent living in LA, and I was afraid to say anything.
I
gotta pay my expensive rent. I gotta get paid for this, or I gotta go.
I know. There weren't a whole lot of jobs.
When I was working, they would want us, they told us that we had to come in 15 minutes early to set up.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's
No,
crazy. No.
Not happening.
No, right.
You're not paying me, I'm not coming in.
Yeah, I know.
Everybody would wait for the last minute to punch in.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why you applied for.
So that's one reason why the Roaring Twenties aren't so roaring. Here's another good reason why the Roaring Twenties aren't so roaring. 71% of the population live below the poverty level. So for those workers, generally in urban areas that have good jobs, say management jobs, you're doing fine. But for most workers, they're not. Industrial workers are finding that their wages are being lowered in the 1920s. So they certainly may be higher than the 1914 $2.50. And then, of course, Ford raised it $5 for his workers if you met all the stipulations. But even Ford Motor Company in the 1920s was cutting its workers' wages. My grandpa told me in 1939, when he got married, he was making $5 a day. And so, 1939 is a long way away from 1914. So he's making $5 a day. Now, my grandma's father thought, when he met my grandpa, thought, ooh, $5 a day, that's a lot, because they were living on a farm in the UP, and they weren't making that much money. But still, if you think $5 a day in 1939, over 20 years, 25 years after it had been raised, that's not that much money. There was an agricultural depression. That's a big part of why many people are not doing so well in the 1920s. Now, even though over 50% of the population lives in cities and towns, it still means that a large portion of the population lives in rural areas and are making their living doing something associated with agriculture. And there's this agricultural depression because farmers had a labor shortage during the First World War, when so many millions of men had been drafted, and they needed to invest in expensive machinery. They took out large loans, which allowed them to produce more crops, which was, of course, on the one hand good, but then on the other hand, once the crops started to come in, that meant that prices dropped because there was overproduction. And so prices are lower, yet they still have to pay off their loans for all these machines that they had bought. And in the 1920s, rural America falls into a depression. So everybody, of course, you've taken many history classes during your careers as students. Everybody knows of the Great Depression in the 1930s, right? But when you think about it, rural people actually had, instead of 10 years of depression, they had 20 years of depression. So they suffered for twice as long as people in cities did. But then we should also keep in mind that you had this agricultural depression, but you also had the industrial workers starting to be paid less as well. And so, and remember, 71% of the population is already living below the poverty level. So really, America's not doing as well as you tend to think the 1920s should have been, giving a good lifestyle to people. But people are living on a lot of credit in the 1920s. They're borrowing a lot. People are investing in the stock market more than ever before. And so a lot of people who think they have money are really just living on credit, and then that, of course, will all crumble apart eventually. But before we get to all that, here's an interesting aspect of the 1920s. We tend to think of the radio as just something that you listen to maybe when you're in the car. But in the 1920s, of course, there are no car radios. If you're on a radio, do you even know? So let me. This is actually a radio, in case you don't know.
I was about to say,
this enormous piece of furniture right here is a radio. But radios become pretty common in the 1920s. Wireless technology had been perfected about 10 years earlier. Actually, the first radio broadcaster coming out in the late 19-teens. But then, when we enter World War I in 1917, the government puts a ban on all wireless communication except for military purposes. So there's a delay in then the American public actually being able to go out and buy radios and having radio broadcasts. So people love the radio. People sit around at night staring at their radios, listening to radio broadcast programs like shows that you watch on Amazon and Netflix nowadays. So there were comedies, there were dramas, there were mysteries, so soap operas, all kinds of things. News broadcasts, of course. So you could have the outside world come right into your home. It was essentially a miracle to people. This is something that just amazed people. My grandma, I have lots of stories because my grandparents grew up at this time. My grandma said when the first time she saw a radio, they had gone into town, and they came home and told their father, and he didn't believe them. He said, "You kids will believe anything." So. Fast foods, which we think is something relatively modern. Fast food appears for the first time in American history. So like the fast food chain like we're familiar with today. And so White Castles is the first fast food chain in America.
Really?
You get a hamburger for 5 cents.
I heard they're finally going to open one in California. I'm excited.
Oh, really? They're going to give In-N-Out Burger a run for their money. I like it In-N-Out Burger better.
I just had one of them In-N-Out burgers.
Oh,
Wow.
nice.
It wasn't all that. I think I like our burgers better.
Well, they'll have to
1921, huh?
order it
Yeah.
a certain way, but they're secret.
So, White Castle, this was a good marketing scheme to make your building look like a little castle, which of course they still do today.
Mm-hmm. Look bigger.
Yeah. Americans began to go to the movies in greater numbers than ever before. Going to the movies becomes very, very popular in the 19-teens. And the movies had certainly been around since the late 19th century when the technology is first developed. But in the 1920s, the people loved going to the movies. Certainly you could stay home and listen to your radio, but obviously you could go to the theater and see pictures with it. So people just thought that was the most amazing thing. And the huge, these big movie companies in Hollywood were making enormous amounts of money at the time because they not only made the movies, but they also built the theaters. So they started to build these elaborate theaters like the Fox. There's different Foxes. Fox here in Detroit, in Atlanta, in San Francisco were 3 major ones. But they spared no expense. Detroit, we have so many of them that have survived because unfortunately so many of those buildings were abandoned in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And luckily the buildings were not torn down. So. The Fisher Theater was a movie theater as well. I just thought I chose this picture. It was Mayan inspired. So just like the Fox, which was very exotic. Have most of you guys been to the Fox at some point? Just
Yeah.
something? Some of you? Yeah. Yeah, it was a whole different experience going to the movies in one of those theaters. So people used to dress up. People were, most people, of course, are not used to going to elaborate buildings like that. So even today, so it was really quite an experience. Here's the Fox. This is what the lobby looked like in San Francisco. Unfortunately, it was torn down.
The Fox.
It was a French palace.
This looks like the one in Detroit.
There was one in
too.
Detroit. Yeah, there's similarities definitely. There was a French-inspired one in Detroit, but now it's a parking structure. You can see parts of it on the inside. They like tore up the floors and they built a parking structure.
So it was like a man's club.
I think it's the old Michigan Theater
Oh.
in Detroit. Yeah, even part of the proscenium's there, and part of the drapes are still there. All right, let's get into some politics now. Warren G. Harding becomes the 29th President of the United States when he wins the 1920 election. Warren G. Harding is a candidate, he's basically a compromise candidate who everybody agrees to nominate him basically because he hadn't done much. And so therefore he hadn't done anything controversial. And even though he had been in the Senate for many years, he really never apparently took his job that seriously. He had also owned a newspaper in Ohio, so he was a newspaper publisher in Ohio, in Marion, Ohio. He was, as I put here, unfit for the responsibilities of President of the United States. He even said so himself when he was alive. So he couldn't make up his mind about who was right. He thought everybody sounded good when they were talking to him. And he shouldn't have been, they should not have nominated him. He was actually asked by party officials at the time of the convention, during the nominating convention, if there's any reason why he shouldn't be President of the United States. If we get a chance on next Tuesday, I have a series of little short documentaries that were done on each president, and I'll show you the video on Warren G. Harding. But they asked him, like, is there any reason why you shouldn't be President of the United States? He had like a very, very long affair with this woman and had a baby with her. The Republican Party paid for this woman and her husband to leave the country during the election. He had apparently had some mental problems. He had checked himself into a sanatorium several times as well. So there were a number of reasons why he probably shouldn't have been president. But anyway, he's generally considered to be one of the top 3 worst presidents ever in the United States. Whenever historians take a vote, he usually ends up either 1, 2, or 3. It depends on how you look at it. I would generally rank either Andrew Johnson or Buchanan as the worst. Buchanan, of course, before Lincoln. Johnson after Lincoln. Buchanan, who didn't do anything when the South seceded, just let them all go away. Let the third of the military leave their posts and go home, and didn't arrest anybody. So I'd say that's very bad. Andrew Johnson, of course, you learned about how he dealt with Reconstruction in the beginning of the semester, right? So Andrew Johnson's the other guy who's with Harding. These 3 are the top 3.
They were just starting out now.
Yeah, right. So he actually dies of a heart attack at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco on his way home from a trip to Alaska in the summer of 1923. He actually made a comment when the ship had a slight accident that he had hoped it had gone down. Because he was not enjoying himself being President of the United States.
I would check myself in too. What can I do to not be president no more?
He had to deal with a series of scandals in the short time that he was President of the United States because he could not make good decisions about who to put into like his cabinet or as high-ranking government officials, and so he just put in place a bunch of his rich friends.
Oh no! Sounds like mommy.
And so he felt like he owed them something, but the problem was, just like him, they didn't have a lot of experience, and so they were corrupt. He at least was not corrupt. He was, I don't necessarily could say he's like the most honorable, morally right, good person
He's
ever.
honest about not being able to handle president.
Yeah, he was honest about that. His Secretary of the Interior, who had been a friend of his, Albert Fall, was found to have taken bribes, and a land that during the Progressive Era had been protected by the government. It was supposed to, remember we learned about preservation and conservation. Preservation, you don't touch land. Conservation, like Teddy Roosevelt was, some of the land is going to be touched, some of it's not, but some of it is to the benefit of the people, which was one of your questions. Well, some of this land that's supposed to be set aside was not. That Secretary of Interior took money, he took land, cattle land somewhere out west was part of the bribe, and he let some oil company drill oil in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, as well as there was other land as well. So that was very bad. I just read on my phone yesterday that the Trump administration was ordered by a court that they couldn't, the Trump administration had tried to allow the oil companies not to follow the law on protecting the birds in this country.
What?
And on the land where they were drilling, and a judge just blocked that yesterday.
Okay, so.
But that was
You didn't
just
know
made me
what
think
happened?
about this because I feel like
the
these
influence
oil companies want special rights that everybody else, why should, well, not like I would want to go around and kill birds. I want to protect the birds, but we have to follow the law. Why should an oil company that's already degrading the land not have to follow the law? So there were many scandals to Teapot Dome. So when we say it's the Teapot Dome scandal, it's really scandals, technically, because there are other high-ranking officials that did very bad things. The Attorney General took bribes from his former law clients so that they wouldn't be prosecuted. The Attorney General's private secretary, after meeting with the president, committed suicide.
Whoa.
Presumably, they talked about what was going to happen to both the Attorney General and Jesse Smith, his secretary, for being involved in this. Charles Forbes, the director of the Veterans Bureau, embezzled $200 million from our veterans. $200 million is an enormous sum of money today. Just imagine when this is something like 20 times or 30 times the amount of money that it is even today.
I thought they
What do you do
probably
with all
thought they was
that
gonna
money?
live good forever.
Yeah, I don't know. Ask Bill Gates, he has $104 billion.
Oh,
He
Jay-Z
donates
just
a lot
made
of
He
it.
does
the
donate a
Millionaires
lot.
Club.
I just watched the documentary on.
It's a black person in the
And Charles Kramer, who was general counsel, so the lawyer for the Veterans Bureau, was also involved with this embezzlement scheme somehow, and he committed suicide.
Oh my God.
So,
They're taking the easy way out.
They were threatened for sure.
No, they just wanted to do the crime and not pay for the time.
that's generally how it works.
Yeah.
What most people don't realize is that they're going to get caught. Yeah, then there are actually other crimes committed, but there are things like jury tampering with one of these guys. One of them was actually allowed to flee the country because he's warned by the president, we're going to arrest you, and he beats it out of the country.
Oh my God.
That's probably the guy with the 20 million,
Yeah.
200 million. or
I'd have to go
whatever.
back, look at all. I have to go back and read everything, but there's a lot that went on. Like we could talk about this for probably 2 hours, just the Teapot Dome scandal. And yet the public tended to love President Harding because his campaign was, when he became president, they liked him because he was this kind of kindly old man. He talked about a return to normalcy. So he wanted to make America like it was back in the good old days, which of course there's never a good old days. If you have to, whenever you live, it's got good things and bad things, and that's just
I
how
know
it is.
that's
No
right.
matter when you live. So they want to go back to the days before World War I, before lots of people were killed, when things were more simple, before America was industrialized, and so that's the type of thing that people are nostalgic for, and that's what led Harding to the White House. So, but of course he died, and before he could even finish his 4 years in office.
Oh, just so close though.
So, right. 1924 was the election year, but he didn't make it. And he dies in August of 1923. So his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, originally from Vermont, Plymouth Notch, Vermont is where he was born, a farm boy, becomes a lawyer, a prominent lawyer. He will now become the 30th president of the United States.
I never heard of him.
Calvin Coolidge is known for essentially not talking very much and not really having a sense of humor.
Well, I could tell, because I don't know nothing about him.
Apparently there was a woman at a dinner at the White House one time and who said, sat next to him and said, I have a bet that I can make you say more than 2 words. And he said, try me.
I love it.
Yeah. So, and yet, his wife was just the opposite.
I bet.
Grace Coolidge was this beautiful, vivacious woman. One of the most stunning portraits in the White House collection of a First Lady is Grace Coolidge wearing this 1920s red gown with, I didn't put it in here. Red gown with, they had a beautiful white dog. It was one of those Afghan, I think it was an Afghan. You know what an Afghan is? Those beautiful, big, long dogs with big, all that fur. Yeah, and so she painted with her dog. Yeah. So she was just the opposite of him. But so opposites attract, I guess. Everybody loved Grace, but nobody really cared for Calvin.
Well, what about when he had to do speeches?
Well,
They got a speech
then he
of-
had to
of
go.
some
Then he had to.
speech, a speaker
Yeah.
or something.
So anyway, this was his. This is actually where he was born. This is where he became president because he was on summer vacation, visiting his elderly father, who was somewhere about 90 years old or over 90. And it's a state park in Vermont today. So, and the news of Harding's death arrived in the middle of the night on August the 3rd. And so the president and Mrs. Coolidge were awakened from their sleep. And the president's father administered the oath of office. The president's father was very proud of this fact. What the president's father didn't know is when they went back to Washington, D.C., they called the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to administer the oath of office again. And they never told the president's father until at all, because that would have just hurt the guy. But they said they thought that the president should take the oath of office, and the only person of any type of status, like in the area, was his father, who was a notary public. So I don't.
Wait, so Coolidge's father
Yep.
was a notary,
Yeah.
and he did his public oath, his presidential oath.
Yes.
But that was the first one.
It was Grace Coolidge.
Oh.
He's fine. Girl, yes, I already told you I wanted to do that. You know I got a lot. I should.
I guess I should put it.
You don't get to see her.
Trump, I hate Hillary, I hate them all.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, I was about to show you. See?
I just requested this after that. Where?
Hello, President.
She wearing ballet
We can look it up.
So when I was in Plymouth Notch, not this summer, but last summer, because it's not that far from where I go out to do my research for the book I'm gonna write. They told us about how there was no telephone in the Coolidge house because old Mr. Coolidge refused to allow any new gadgets. That's why they had no electricity. They had a kerosene lamp, and so the nearest phone was at the general store down the street. And the lady who owned the general store, it was the middle of the night, and she was sound asleep and didn't hear the phone ring. And so then the White House called the Secret Service, because most of the Secret Service were sleeping at the inn about 10 miles north of there.
10 miles?
And so
That's so far.
it's kind of far. So then they call that hotel. They wake up the Secret Service, and the Secret Service rushes down to the president's house to bangs on the door and wakes the president up and tells him that Harding is dead. And so they go through this big thing, you know, they take oath of office, and then the news spread, of course, everywhere. All kinds of people from the surrounding countryside come into Plymouth Notch to wave goodbye to the new president, as him and the family. They all go to Washington for the funeral, of course, of Harding. And the lady in the general store across the street, she never woke up until it was all over with. Everyone went home, and she woke up, and then she comes out and is like, what was going on? And they tell her, and she apparently was so mad, like for years after that, she couldn't believe that she missed every.
Slept through it all.
Especially the phone call.
Yeah, especially the phone call.
Right.
There's one other thing, actually, when I was at Plymouth Notch, which I found fascinating. It was something that I had not known about, is that there was a buffalo hide hanging in the carriage barn, hanging over the sleigh. And they said in the early decades of the 20th century, in the late 19th century, like everybody, they said everybody in the late 19th century, not the early 20th century, but everyone in the late 19th century had a buffalo hide that they used in their carriages or in their sleighs when it was cold to keep them warm, because buffalo hides were so inexpensive because they had killed millions of buffaloes.
Yeah.
And but then, of course, by the turn of the 20th century, they became extremely scarce and expensive. But they said every household had a buffalo hide, and I was like, which I'd never thought about, but it made sense when you consider how many they killed. That the stores must have been flooded with them.
Yeah.
So
Well, I thought when they
little side
when they-
note.
I thought when they were killing them, they just killed them.
A lot of times they did. A lot of times they just killed them too. But
So they
apparently
didn't
some of
skin
them
them?
they skinned them and
Oh.
sent
Probably
them
some
off.
of them farmers, the natives.
Somebody got smart.
Yeah.
Sold them.
Well, terrible. Of course, one of the big things that people think of in the 1920s is Charles Lindbergh's famous flight across the ocean nonstop from New York to Paris. A wealthy hotel owner put up $25,000, his last name was Ortiz, to challenge aviators to develop an airplane that could fly nonstop from New York to Paris. And it was something that, of course, had been impossible when he put up the $25,000 in 1919. But Lindbergh, as well as many other people in the 1920s, were working on airplanes that could do exactly that. But Lindbergh's the one who did it. The others who came before him failed, oftentimes being killed on their way. Many times not taking into consideration weight. There were planes that had gone down because they were too heavy, or they were carrying too many things. Sometimes they'd take presents with them for friends in Europe. And Lindbergh, he took a toothbrush, and that's about it.
I mean, everything else you could buy when you get there.
Yeah, no, and his passport. He took a toothbrush and his passport.
I mean,
And so, yeah, and some,
but
I
he
guess some
drove
water.
33 hours. What did
And he did take a life raft. That was the only concession to weight that he made. Is he took a raft in case he had to ditch the plane that he had hoped that he could get the life raft out and then he could float and be saved. But that's yeah. He flew the whole time. He apparently was starting to hallucinate eventually because it was no sleep.
3 hours is
Yeah, it's a
long.
long time.
That's
Yeah.
how long it took me to drive from
Who put
California.
up the 25,000?
A guy, I don't remember his first name. But, he was
No.
Charles or Frederick, I don't know, or Teague.
How do you pee?
Oh,
That's
Teague. Oh.
that's what the King of England asked him. Yeah, King George.
How do you poop?
King George asked him. Well, he didn't, but he took a bottle.
Oh, yeah, you guys have that luxury.
Yeah, the King of England asked him the question. Yeah, actually, Lindbergh had planned on. Actually, after he got there, he had planned on going, traveling around Europe. He had not been to Europe before. But the world went crazy, like the Europeans went crazy, the Americans went crazy over it. And so in France, they began to rip apart his airplane. Like they were literally, like thousands of people were waiting for him to land. And when they did, they rushed the plane, like to congratulate him, but then they also started to like pry off pieces of the airplane to take it as souvenirs.
How are you supposed to get back?
So if you ever go to the Smithsonian Institution and see the plane, a lot of it had to be rebuilt because it was such a wreck. Yeah. And then the president Calvin Coolidge sent a special naval ship to bring him home.
Okay.
But they did stop in England because the King of England wanted to meet him. And that's when he asked him that question.
How did you go poop?
Did they bring his plane for him? At that time?
Yeah, I don't know. I never read the story. I don't know. I mean, obviously at some point it got home, so maybe.
Yeah, he got it.
Yeah. And then when he got home, there were big parades for him. There was a special dinner for him. The president and Mrs. Coolidge held. There was actually White House was being renovated, and so they were renting a house. So, and to that generation, he was really this great, iconic figure. Young people just idolized Charles Lindbergh. So he was a symbol that Americans could do anything. So, of course, nowadays, nobody thinks anything about taking an airplane ride. I mean, it can still be exciting, obviously, if you're going on a trip, but you can cruise at 30,000 feet, drinking a glass of champagne, or whatever, Yeah. But on that note, what you probably never learned before was that John Alcock and Arthur Burton, two British subjects, in 1919, actually did make a transatlantic flight, not as long as Lindbergh's, but they flew from St. John's, Newfoundland, to County Galloway, Connemara in County Galloway, Ireland. So from the west coast of North America, the very furthest point in North America, easterly point, to the furthest westerly point in Europe. And so that was a big deal. They barely made it, but they did make it 16 hours and 12 minutes. Anyone ever heard of them before?
No.
Yeah. I had one student in the other class.
I heard about
it's
the
not very
brothers,
common. The Wright brothers.
Yeah.
Well, that's good.
I heard about those brothers. And it was a lady too.
So, 1920s, of course, is known as a big party time, but yet it's illegal to have alcohol. Can't make it. It's legal to make it. Legal to buy it. The 18th Amendment made the production, the sales, and the transportation of liquor illegal. Well, technically, it just says that the government has the power to make it, to do with make it illegal if they want to. And then it's the Volstead Act that technically will make it then illegal and create the government agency that will oversee the implementation of the law. So it's known as the National Prohibition Act of 1919, which then says the manufacture, transport, export, and sale or possession of alcohol was illegal in the United States. And it creates the Prohibition Bureau, in which creates government agents who then try to enforce this law, which, of course, you go from, having the Prohibition movement had been around for decades. It was, certainly drinking alcohol was breaking up families. There was a lot of abuse of alcohol in the 19th century.
I believe it.
And, but then with the creation of this amendments of the Constitution and this law, it just creates a whole new set of problems because it leads to more illegal activities by gangs who, of course, would now find another source to make revenue by importing or distilling alcohol. Detroit's a big, it's an international border, so just across the river in Windsor is the Canadian Club Whiskey Factory. So it was easy to go over there and get alcohol. And people would drive across the river during the winter and load up their trunks and their cars and drive back. The canals, in Detroit and St. Clair Shores,
I'm sorry,
you could take your boat.
Drove over the river.
Yeah, the
with a
river
car?
used to freeze. It was colder. Then. There are a lot more harsh winters than we have nowadays. So you could ride on the river.
You were talking about the ice.
Yeah.
Them heavy T-model cars.
Yeah. But they would have boats and they would smuggle this alcohol back from Canada. So, do you know which gang? You guys probably know that, though, right? Yeah, the Purple Gang. So
No, I
that's
didn't
here in
know.
Detroit.
Now I know.
Yeah. There's usually somebody. It's been pretty common, like when everyone does their family tree project. And I've had it several times where there's people had relatives who had been somehow associated with the Purple Gang. I had a great uncle who was a bootlegger, but he was in the UP and then down here, but he wasn't part of the Purple Gang. He just made whiskey, and he sold it. He actually made one kind of whiskey. He only made one. I'm sure it was horrible whiskey. I don't know. But anyway, he made this whiskey. He had 3 different prices and 3 different bottles, 3 different labels. So if he came in and said, I want the expensive whiskey, he'd go in the back and put a label on the bottle and say, here's your whiskey. And if you said, I want your cheap whiskey, he'd go in the back, put the other label on it.
So you might as well just get the cheap whiskey.
Well, nobody knew that. So
Same
that was
whiskey,
his
huh?
little scheme.
Just make you think you're getting the expensive one.
My grandpa's turning over in the grave right now that I'm spilling the family secret.
He's gonna come back and haunt you.
Yep. Yeah. So anyway, a lot of people who were normally, very honest, when did illegal things during Prohibition. People made gin in their bathtubs. My great grandma used to talk about making blackberry brandy in the bathtub. I used to say, well, how do you guys? Because it's got to sit there for several days. And how do you take a bath? No one did.
No,
That's
not so.
gross. In those days, people usually only bathed once a week anyway.
Yeah.
So.
You know what?
Be glad you didn't live in the old days, because I as a historian, I'm
I
always
could just
nostalgic
work
about it, but it
more.
was disgusting.
Coolidge. Look, I'll be the first.
So, people went to speakeasies. So speakeasies were these illegal nightclubs that sold alcohol. Bars still survived, but they they sold things like non-alcohol beer, like beer that's like whatever, I don't know what that is because I wouldn't drink it, but like 1% or something like that, and then actually soda fountains. So the bartenders, like during the 1920s, some of them like these bars to stay open, they started serving ice cream and making like milkshakes and like would have soda fountains. So like all these elaborate kind of ice cream drinks that are still around nowadays are created during Prohibition. But lots of people went to these speakeasies. We don't know exactly how many there were in the country or anywhere for that matter, because obviously you're not going to write on the U.S. Census that you own a speakeasy so they can come and arrest you. So, but it's estimated in New York City there could have been as many as 100,000 speakeasies just in New York alone. So, I just drove by Blossom Heath in St. Clair Shores yesterday.
What's that?
And it's like a banquet hall, but in the 1920s it was a speakeasy. My cousin's grandma used to go to it.
You got a lot of
Because when I was a kid, our family's weddings were always there, and my cousin's grandma used to sit with us kids. She liked to talk to us kids, and she would tell us stories. And she said like she went on a date at Blossom Heath. Because it was when we were kids too, it wasn't very much, it hadn't changed very much. So there was, she's like, see that, like the whole drape of the ballroom was like the whole ceiling was draped in red velvet. Well, but it had like turned like dark brown or something like that.
Right.
That time. And she's like, that used to all be red velvet. And she'd tell stories about how there were like gambling tables upstairs, and there was a little button on the back of the newel post or the staircase to alert them upstairs if they were being raided. And everybody of course knew where the speakeasies were, and so that was leading to crime as well because the police were being paid off, they're taking bribes. My grandpa said that his car broke down one time. My grandpa was in a band, and their car broke down one time in front of Blossom Heath. I don't know if it was called that at the time, but anyway. And the bouncers were all upset that he had to get his piece of junk car out of the way because they didn't want to attract attention to the place. Which I thought was funny because, of course, you know, most people knew that it was there. I'm sure the authorities knew it was there.
Yes, they did.
Yeah. A little more serious note. Well, not like that's not serious. That was serious, but it can be funny as well. But anyway, the first Red Scare, America's first major encounter with worrying about the spread of communism. Of course, the revolution in Russia had been successful in the spread of these Marxist ideas, communist ideas, are spreading across Europe as well as here in the United States. Of course, workers who have, are still not doing that well. There's worries that people who are disaffected will take up these ideas. And also, you find that there were anarchists who really want to overturn society, bring about a change, and they were actually mailing bombs to prominent people in this country. And so there's this short period of time between 1919 and 1920 where radicals are being rounded up and deported. So, and the Attorney General even was. This is the new Attorney General, of course. Oh wait, no, sorry. This is the Attorney General under Wilson, because Wilson's still in office until March of 21.
Wasn't there a famous actor that was accused of being communist?
Oh, during the second Red Scare, there are a lot of them. Yeah, we'll get to that when we get to. That's the next
I
unit.
didn't know there was two.
Yeah, that's not for a few more weeks. We'll get to that though. You're absolutely right. So anyway, of course there had been for decades fear of foreigners. I showed you that one cartoon where there were the shadows back on the wall that one day, and it was all peasants, and yet it was all those dandies wearing all their finery, and of course the newer generation saying that they don't want immigrants coming, and that's of course common in American history, unfortunately. We're going through something like that today, and there had been many agitating for laws restricting the numbers of people that could immigrate from Europe, and finally in the 1920s they're successful. Certainly the Red Scare, you can see that could be part of the reasoning why Congress passes these laws. There's also not the need for as many European workers as there had been, because during World War I they realized that African Americans can come up from the Deep South and work in the American northern factories as well. So anyway, essentially the doors are closed to foreigners, but not south of our border. Just from Asia, of course, which had already been in place, and then from Europe. And they especially wanted to stop immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So 2 laws, actually there were 3 laws, but first in 1921, the Emergency Quota Act reduces immigration by 2/3. It's all based on the 1910 census. Then Congress says that's not restrictive enough, and so then in 1924 they passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which reduces immigration from these European nations to 2% of the 1890 census, when the population from places like Italy, from Russia, from Eastern Europe, it was much lower. And then by the late 20s, there'll even be another, even more restrictive law that essentially closes the doors altogether. All right, so we're going to have to end here.
Good luck with today's lesson.